Hey guys, so today I'm doing, I guess, kind of like a book review, and then also like a little bit of philosophizing. So I don't know where I'm going to be going with this one, but I am going to cover this book, Ayn Rand, Atlast Shrugged. So this book is pretty long. It's about almost 11,000 pages. Not 11, 1,100 pages. It's like 10,079. And so, spoiler alert, I'm pretty much going to ruin the book for you if you haven't read it already. But if you've read it, then I encourage you to watch this video. And if you haven't read it yet, don't watch the video yet. Read the book first, then come back, and maybe this video will give you an idea of how to think about the book. But that also depends on what you think about it, because the whole point is you're supposed to use your brain to get thoughts out of it for you, not use my brain to summarize the book for you and then take nothing away from it. Because this is more like a philosophy book, although it is pretty entertaining because it's written in a format where it's kind of like a novel. So I don't remember the characters or anything like that because it's been a while. So I can't remember every single one. But I know there's Dagny Taggart, she's the main character. And then you have a few other guys who work with her. And they basically form this whole company, and because of them, society functions the way it does. Okay, so let me start with some misconceptions about this book. So some people think this book, in a broad sense, is just about how capitalism is so great and how we shouldn't have any government and the rich people should be allowed to do whatever they want. Now, I don't particularly agree with that viewpoint. I come to think of it that people either don't read the book thoroughly or don't actually think about what's being said in the book, or they just lack some sort of common sense. I don't know. But the point of the book isn't to encourage being capitalistic and being all about making the rich richer. That's a lie. Now, what I think the book is about basically being greedy in the mode that you're pursuing something that benefits you will allow others to benefit off of you, instead of having them benefit off you in a different way. So let's say you have to give money to charity because you're so successful. It's like, rather, the way the book points it out is more like you want to be successful and you have skills at creating charities. So what do? You create charities to accumulate some wealth for yourself, but in the process of accumulating wealth and creating those charities, because you're so good at it, you're able to help so many other people through your charities. Not because your goal is to make the best charity in the world, or the charity that gives the most money to people. Your goal is to create the charity that brings in the most money, that gets the most donations, but also makes you the most money. And that motivation, being selfish as it is helping other people, whether you want to or not. So, let me start off with the beginning of the book. So at the beginning we have Dagny Taggart, and she's in charge of the railroad. Now also take into consideration that this book was written, I'm checking the copyright because that'll probably give me a date. Okay, so it was in 1957. So around That's around like 60 years ago when this book was written. And Ayn Rand was living around the 1920s, 30s, I think, is when she was a little younger and started writing books or something. I'm probably wrong, but anyways, think of it, pretty much 100 years from now is when she was around. So things back then were a lot different, and the story goes off of railroads. So railroads were a giant thing back then for transportation, for getting the economy going, pretty much for everything. So that's why the book focuses on railroads. Some people might be stupid and ignorant and be like, oh, well, it's about railroads, that doesn't apply to us because we don't use railroads anymore, or they'll think it only applies to railroads. And it's like, that's not the point. The point is that was the main economic engine back then, was railroads. So that's what she used as an example. That is one of the big industries back then. You can change that to any industry today. It'll still be the same story. It's just that this is easier for her to get information on and create a story about, because it's something that was prevalent and something that you could easily read in the newspapers and gather information about and think about. Today it may be something different. I don't know what it is, but if I were to guess, it would be wars, oil, something like that. So anyways, let me start from the beginning. We have Dagny Taggart, who's in charge of a railroad company. And we have Francisco, don't quite remember the last name, but his name's Francisco, and he was in charge of a large copper mine. Dagny was in charge of a railroad. Now, it wasn't her that was in charge, it was her brother, Jim, I think. But anyways, she was pretty much the one making sure that the railroad ran on time, making sure that everything went according to plan. She pretty much, if you haven't looked at the title, you have, this would be the guy, and he's carrying the world on his back. Dagny was pretty much in this position, carrying the weight of the world on her back. That's why it's called Atlast Shrugged, because the weight of the world was eventually shrugged off. So, she was the one bearing all the weight, making sure that everything ran. She was the one taking full responsibility because nobody else would. And she was very smart. She was one of those people who was very innovative and knew how to produce. And in doing so, everybody else benefited off of that. There are other companies that are benefiting off of her being productive. Everybody in the company she was working in, Taggart Transcontinental, was profiting off of her because she was working so hard. Now, in the perfect world, you work hard, you get rewarded for it, but also, because you're doing something that other people see as beneficial, they'll want to take part in that. They'll benefit off of it in some way, but the one who's primarily benefiting off of it is you. But say, other businesses will be benefiting off of your business because your business is essential to their business. And pretty much, in this case, nothing goes wasted, I suppose. Now, as we progress further in the book, we discover there's the government, which has different regulations over time that prevent Dagny from doing certain things or make it harder for her. Or we look at Hank Rearden. Hank Rearden's a character in this book who is very innovative. He produces this new metal. So this new metal, I don't know if I'm exaggerating here, if I remember right, it's been a while since I read the book, but this metal is lighter, it's easier to produce than other types of metal used for the rail at that time. It's cheaper to produce, and it's sturdier and it's safer. So it's got all these benefits attached to it. Now, the government puts regulations on it and says that it's not safe for use, And so pretty much the government tries to stop Hank Rearden from selling this metal, which is very innovative and revolutionary and would change the world. Now, why would the government do this? It's because there's other companies that are producing metal as well for railroads. The problem with them is they're not as innovative and they're not as efficient as Hank Rearden's company. But because they have such a close relationship with the government, they're able to throw in regulations that make it so that Hank Rearden can't do the best job. He can't produce that metal. Instead, he's either limited in producing the metal, limited to who he can sell to, the amount he can sell, the amount he can make off of that, and whatever. And all these regulations that pretty much make it unprofitable for him to produce that product. Now let me sidetrack for a second, because I think of something in today's modern world that seems similar to this concept. And if you think the book didn't apply to the modern world, it does. So, we have people in America, and the only ones I can think of are farmers. So let's say we have farmers who are getting subsidized by the government to produce corn at the cheapest price possible. But people in India or in Africa or in South America can produce the corn at extremely low prices. So much so that if the government didn't subsidize the American farmers, they would not be able to compete and they'd go out of business. Now, in the perfect world, the government would not subsidize the people living in the United States to produce corn because they were inefficient at producing it. And if other people were producing it, let's assume the same quality, to the same standards, same safety, but they were producing it in larger amounts and in a way that was way cheaper. So let's say they used less water, for example. They also sprayed less pesticides and all these other benefits. If they could do that, why in the hell are we producing corn when somebody else can produce it a lot better than us? If anything, we should let them produce corn, and we should move on to something else. And ideally, we would want to end that relationship between subsidizing those people that aren't producing as much as they could be producing or as efficient as they could be producing, and take away the regulations that would prevent other people from being able to compete, because essentially subsidization prevents those people who are more efficient from competing in the marketplace. Now, this does go into economics, and you could argue that, well, if we do that, then all the people in that other country would have a monopoly on producing that one thing, and we wouldn't have a monopoly. And in a sense, I'd have to agree with that is something you have to come into terms with, but the logic of this book follows that essentially granting that monopoly will benefit not only that company, but also us, because we'll get cheaper prices. Now, that may or may not be true in the real world, but for the sake of the argument of this book, it's true that monopolies do benefit us. Now, I know economists may argue differently, and that's perfectly fine, because any theory that we essentially have never really works out the way we write it on paper. It's always a few little factors that change it and create totally different outcomes. But anyhow, let's get back to the story. So the government was interfering because there were people that had relationships with the government. Essentially, they got subsidizations for their company, preventing Hank Rearden from being able to produce his materials the most efficiently. Now, the way you see this, and you don't really think about it, or you may not really think about it, I certainly didn't, is the government, by putting in these regulations and hurting this one company, even if it didn't intend to, it started hurting Taggart Transcontinental's business. because they were hoping to lay down this new and efficient rail and become more efficient through that. But they couldn't, because there was a limitation on how much they could use. There was also a whole bunch of regulations preventing them from being able to use it. Now, I'm going to sidetrack here again, but I think of the automotive industry in today's world, where, yes, we do have cars that are more fuel efficient. I've seen reports that and articles that state that there's cars out there that have 200 miles per gallon, or the capacity for 200 miles per gallon, and fuel efficiency. Now imagine how cheap gas would be if you could do that. But because it's in the best interest of the oil industry and the automotive industry, instead of producing cars that would be more fuel efficient, because of partnerships with some of the people in the government creates regulations that prevents us from having access to these types of cars. Instead, we're left with cars that are 15 miles per gallon or something terrible like that. And if they could, they'd make it so that we had 1 mile per gallon probably. Why? Because it would benefit the oil industry. And now, this is a little crooked, but you may or may not think that people can or cannot be bought. But in this instance, some people can be bought when they're going into Washington. You pay them a few $1,000s, develop some sort of a relationship with them, bribe them, whatever, and you can get them to create policies for you that are favorable. Now, this may or may not be true. I may be ignorant of a few things, but for the sake of my argument, we'll assume that this is what occurs in the United States, is that government can be bribed so that you can create laws that favor your company, although they hurt the majority. Because this is another topic covered in the book, is essentially this type of greed where you benefit in the short term, but in the long term there's no benefit. You're really just taking away from others. You're destroying people's wealth to create wealth for yourself, but to create the wealth that you require, you destroy even more wealth to bring in wealth. And anyways, getting back on track. So these people create regulations that benefit these companies. And they hurt all these other companies that are involved in basically the United States' distribution system for goods and materials and what have you. They basically mess up the railroads. They mess up the companies that produce the metal to lay down the rail. They mess up the companies that deliver raw materials that need to be, in this case, the raw materials that Dagny needs to support the railroad. And through these little regulations and whatnot, they eventually start ruining one industry after another. And eventually even the agricultural industry is ruined. Because the whole infrastructure of the United States falls apart. So basically farmers have food that they want to be able to sell to the public, but because they have no trains to transport it on, they're not able to deliver those goods to their customers on time. So they're forced to sell local. And because of that, they'll farm less, because it's just not worth it to produce this vast amount for hundreds of millions of people when they're only going to be serving a few 100,000 people. So businesses start getting smaller, not because they want to, but because they have to in order to survive. They start getting smaller, things become more local and community. The whole infrastructure we have that connects us from coast to coast falls apart. Now in this example, yes, it's trains that drive the whole coast-to-coast connection, but that does not matter. It could be cars, it could be horses, it could be airplanes, it could be whatever the hell you want it to be. The whole point is that, trains back then were one of the main ways of transporting goods. Now, we probably use a lot more cars because that's something that's become efficient to do. But, you get the same thing. It becomes more expensive for oil companies to produce something they don't want to produce anymore, or it becomes expensive to transport food. People don't want to transport food anymore, or you need oil or whatever. Whatever you need becomes unavailable because that industry has collapsed. Other industries start collapsing after that. And then you have basically a collapse of the whole United States, which is something that goes in this book. Now, as we progress in the book, now this isn't true in real life, but in the book, people are given an option. People who are producing, being innovative, doing things that benefit society. So I'll sidetrack again here and give you an example of people that benefit society. So, and here, think of the person who invented the car. Think of the person who invented the internet. I mean, there's probably a few people who invented the internet, came together and invented it, Just an example, let's say one person invented the internet. Had they not existed, the internet would not exist. Think of how much different the world would be today. So people who produce very great innovations, those people in this book, they start disappearing. And they're basically given this option, which they come into realization to at the end of the book. Because of something I talked about a little earlier, which is because of the way the government is run and the corruption in the government at that time, the people benefiting from the policies or the companies getting subsidized. Now, how they made money, how they were making money off of this, was basically they were destroying wealth to create wealth. So they weren't creating more wealth and then distributing it. They were destroying wealth. So think about this, and I guess this applies to credit card companies or something like that. Basically, the best way I can think of it is you have $1,000 loan. Technically, that's money. Now, you don't actually have these $1,000, but you're going to pay interest on that money, you're going to pay fees on that money, and you're going to pay taxes on that money. So, to pay back that money, you have to pay back more money in real dollars than you ever had in real dollars. Those $1,000 that you took out on credit, you never had, you never saw them. But when you pay back those $1,000, you're paying back $1,500. You're paying $500 of real wealth for $500 that didn't exist. Now, when you go into the masses, the credit card companies are taking money from you that never existed when you took out the loan. Now, people who default on loans or whatever, it's money that never existed and never will exist. And in this case, I think it was with taxes. So they tax you so high. So let's say you get $1,000 and they tax you 50%. So they're taking 50% of your money from millions of people to give that money to some guy. So they give him $1 million. But to give him those $1 million, they had to take away $4 million from the general public so that that guy could get $1 million. You lost $3 million of wealth right there. Now, what happened to the other $3 million? It never existed. It either got taxed away or it just never plain existed in like physical money. It is all basically credit or made up or something. But then the story is you've got $3 million that are gone. Or I guess another way that didn't make sense to you is think of this. You use 10 sheep, turn them into food meal, and then feed it to one cow from its infancy to its adulthood, to basically raise it from a calf to a cow. Now, you took 10 real animals that you could have used for food to create one cow that you can use for food. So instead of having those 10 cows, you now have one cow. Instead of having those 10 sheep, you now have one cow. The hell is wrong with the math right there? Why would you do that? And that's what happens in this book, is that you're destroying the wealth, basically. Now, this is what makes people mad. And when they noticed that the wealth was being destroyed like this, they thought to themselves, well, why are we going to continue to basically work for these companies creating wealth or trying to create wealth when the government's just going to take it away and distribute it around to these worthless scumbags who basically are taking my 10 million profits today and paying themselves $1 million from my $10 million. It's like, what's right in doing that? Because those $10 million are taxed and whatever. They'd go to the general public, or they'd be used by the government for something productive, instead of paying that one asshole $1 million. And then if he ever spends it, or he gets taxed on his income or whatever, he's only getting taxed $1 million when you could have taxed $10 million. Now, these people who are innovators, as I go back to, I know I've been jumping around a lot, but these innovators, they decide they don't want to participate in a system that basically benefits these people, these looters, these wealth destroyers. So they create their own society, which basically, if you don't produce, you don't receive. So you have to produce something, whatever it may be. Let's say, because some of them are holding really what would be considered shit jobs. They would be cleaning somebody's house, polishing somebody's shoes, being a janitor, being a fry cook, being a waitress, whatever. They do these jobs, but they were producing something that demanded value. And in this society, when there's only like 5 other people around you, that was actually worth some money. People would actually pay for that service because they were receiving something in return. It's kind of like, think if I was selling you like a pet rock or something, what? And if I didn't like advertise it or whatever, make it popular, like I just walked up to you on the street and told you, hey, you want to buy this pet rock? And you told me yes, and you said how much. And now let's say that these are being sold for $10, and I told you, well, $100, and you decided to pay $100. Now, you basically know you got ripped off. You know you're not getting any value off of that pet rock. So it's like, why even pay for it? But in this society that they created, basically they went back to their old industries that they had. So Francisco went back to owning a copper mine. Hank Rearden went back to producing his metal. Dagny eventually went back to producing her own railroad. Everybody who was producing something of value in the real world before they moved into this fantasy land, they produced what they were good at producing. And they basically started to make a community, they started to make an economy, they started to make something where everyone else was benefiting off of their work. Because these people enjoyed their work, they were good at it, they were innovative in it, and they were willing to do even more of that work because they wanted to make even more money. So the point of the book was that basically if you're doing something like in this case, you're producing railroads. Now if you find ways to make it more efficient, to make your train go from point A to point B in 5 minutes rather than 10 minutes, and you keep innovating and you keep creating new stuff and you keep basically staying ahead of the curve, people are going to benefit from that. But most importantly, you're doing it because you're greedy as hell. You're not doing it because you want people to benefit off of it. You're doing it because you want to make money. Dagny didn't improve the railways because that was your best interest. She improved it because she knew that if she could make it so that it runs in 5 minutes instead of 10 minutes, instead of 10 runs per day, she could do 50 runs per day. And if she has 10 customers per day who are paying her $100, and you can only do 10 runs, that's only $1,000 a day that you're making. Now if she could improve her efficiency that way, now I think I said 50, so it'd be $5,000 that she's making a day instead of only $1,000. That's what motivates her to do her innovations. That's the greed she's talking about. But it's not pure greed where it's just, oh, I'll charge you more money. I think my services for you are worth $10,000. You should pay me $10,000 to use my railroad. And then that's not the type of greed you want. The type of greed that this book focuses on is the type of greed where it's like, I improve my efficiency, so you should be able to see the value in that. And you'll be like, well, all the competitors out there, you're the most efficient, you're the one giving me the most bang for my buck. I'm going to use you because you're in my best interest, because if I can deliver 50 times in one day, you could make 50 trips in one day and I could make deliveries all day through you. I'll be able to transport more things to my buyer or my supplier or whatever and get more things done that day. So not only are you making more money, but I'm also being greedy by using you because I save money and I produce more. So, in this example, both companies are benefiting from each other's greediness. And that's the type of greed she wants. She doesn't want the type of greed where, think of like, you have absolutely no reason, but you basically stand up there and you ask people for $100 every single day. You just have no reason. You're already wealthy, you're already whatever, you're well off, but you take money from people. Why are you taking money from people? You're not giving them anything in return, you're not providing them any benefit. They're not even helping somebody in need out. You're just taking money from them. That's the type of greed that Ayn Rand doesn't approve of in the book. She wants a type of greed where you're exchanging value for value, and if you're not exchanging value for value, then you're not being the right type of greedy. You're not being the right type of selfish. Now, one of the philosophies in the book was, be selfish. Because if you're selfish, others will benefit through your selfishness. And this is an example of that type of selfishness. It's hard to distinguish, I suppose, what selfishness is, because there's so many definitions of it. But in this case, the term selfishness is basically like, I'm trying to think of a way that people can relate. Maybe in love, like, I guess maybe in love, when you're so in love that you'll basically do anything for that other person, and it's not because you love them, but it's because in some way it satisfies you to do these things. It makes you feel like a better partner, and because you're indulging in your selfish side of providing them these things, they benefit, but it's because you're being selfish. It's not because you love them that you're doing these things for them. It's because you want to feel good about yourself for doing those things. That when you do those things, even though you're doing it out of selfishness and not necessarily love, but the person you love is benefiting off of those things as well, because they see value in what you're doing. So, I can't think of an example, and if that isn't clear, I hope the other example of one business improving its efficiency and the other business benefiting off of that, I hope you see the relationship between that type of selfishness and that type of greed. But that's the type of greed she wanted to promote in her book. Now, and there was another point that she made, which is, don't live for the sake of others. So, real quickly, this reminds me of something with Hank Rearden. So Hank Rearden has his family, and he has his son, which I guess in today's society is something that applies to some families, is they have these kids who are basically moochers. And by moochers, it's basically like, they don't want to produce anything. They don't want to fend for themselves. They just want to take what's yours. So Hank Rearden has a kid, and his kid, he doesn't have a job, and he's basically living on hand-me-outs from daddy. Hank Rearden gives him money. He gives him not a salary, I forget the thing, but if you do your chores, you get some money from your parents or whatever, like $5, or I forget the name of the thing. But anyways, he's getting paid on a weekly basis, some spending money. Has to do absolutely nothing for that money besides put his hand out and accept it. And Hank Rearden's perfectly fine with giving him money. He's okay, whatever, I'll give you money, just don't bug me. But eventually, that isn't enough for his kid. He doesn't want just money. He wants his dad to give him a job at his company. Why? Because he's daddy's little boy. He can get whatever job he wants at that company. His dad owns the company. Hank Rearden, however, doesn't approve of that. And this is something where Ayn Rand gets into the point of moochers. His son, in his eyes, doesn't deserve to work for him because he doesn't have any skills, he doesn't know anything. He's basically worthless as an employee. He's basically worthless as a person because he can't do anything. So Hank Rearden's like, why should I give you a job? You're already earning your money, I'm already giving you money. Why do you want me to give you something you didn't earn? And in this case, the kid gets aggravated. He's like, but I want to have self-meaning. I want to have some fulfillment in my life. I want to do something with my life. But the point of this is, I guess it has to do with entitlement, but it's more of, why should it be handed to you? Why should you deserve to get this job which you're totally unqualified for and have no skills related to that field, and you don't even deserve it, basically? Why should you get something you don't deserve? You're not entitled to that. And that's something that she gets mad about, is that this kid, he has a sense of entitlement towards this thing, but he doesn't deserve it. So why should he get it? Now, as the story progresses more towards the end, Hank eventually decides, you know what, I'm not giving you anything. He's not giving this kid anything anymore. Now, this might be counterproductive to some of you and might enrage some of you. It's your kid. Why aren't you helping them out? Now, but the point of the book is, you have no sense of duty to anybody else besides yourself. And that's like, pretty much goes along with the argument that if you help them feel a sense of entitlement, that they're entitled to your help, whether or not they deserve it, that they have to receive help from you because you're their parent or whatever, you're basically letting them continue living in that path and living in that state of entitlement. And so they're going to continue basically putting their hand out and begging for money. And so he puts a stop to that. And then this brings another point of Ayn Rand, is you don't live for other people's benefit, you live for your own benefit. Although it may be your son or your kid, your wife, they have no reason to expect anything from you at all. You weren't born, you weren't brought into this world to give them the hair on your back, the shirt on your back, just because they're your kid. Yes, they may be your kid, and yes, you might feel an obligation to support them and do things for them, and hell, you might even want to do things for them. But the day they pretty much make it an obligation, where you are basically born to give them all your hard-earned money, that's when you draw the line. Because at some point in their life, and this goes with the other things, your parenting style or whatever, but let's assume they're like 30 years old. It's like, what in the hell gives them the right to think that just because you're their parent that you still have to support them? At that age, commonsensically, they should be able to support themselves. They should be able to do something for themselves. They shouldn't need you. They shouldn't try to basically rely on you. Now, if you want to help them out, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. But if they expect you to help them out, like it's something you have to do, that's where she draws the line and says, no, that's wrong. I don't have to help you out. If I want to help you out, I will help you out. But that's because I want to do it. Not because you want me to do it, or because you think I have to do it, or I should do it. And it might be hard to distinguish that line. But basically, I think of it, sense of entitlement, in that you shouldn't then encourage anybody to have a sense of entitlement. And this is another thing also briefly covered in the book, was like with welfare. The government providing welfare to people, and then some of them get the feeling that they're entitled to that welfare, that they deserve it, but at the end of the day they're not producing anything, they're not doing anything to the benefit of society, and they're just taking money that could be used for, let's say, creating new roads, building new schools, educating our children, providing some public service for us. They're taking that money and using it to buy stupid shit, or basically keep on living the lifestyle which is considered a leech in this book. Now, I'm not sure if I've covered everything in the book, but I mean, it is a pretty long book and there's a lot to it, but I guess I'll just summarize real quickly what I remember. Is that there shouldn't be any sense of entitlement. Anything that happened in this book doesn't exactly apply to today, in the sense that there's different industries that are being talked about. The concepts in the book, though, can be applied to today's world. So the greed, the selfishness, the destruction of wealth, the benefits to society, the corruption, the infrastructure, and also the people who basically make society work because they're so innovative. Now, one of the key takeaways from this book is that you should be selfish in the sense that by doing the most to benefit yourself, that other people will benefit from your selfishness. Now, you gotta distinguish this personally for yourself, if you're being the correct type of selfish or not. Now, the correct type of selfish will bring you wealth, and it'll bring you prosperity and all the good stuff. But it'll also bring other people wealth, and it'll also benefit other people. So, a quick example of this, again, think of some genius composing music because he wants to be rich. Now, he composes some of the best music ever. He becomes rich, but all the other millions of people who don't compose music but like listening to music get to listen to his songs. Not only did he benefit by being greedy, but everybody else benefited by his greed too. And that's the type of greed that needs to be pursued. Not the type of greed that destroys other people's wealth, that basically goes, give me $100, I don't need your money, I just want your money, just give me it. You don't want that. You don't want this guy taking $10 million from you just to get $1 million, costing $10 million to create $1 million. That's completely stupid. It's completely the wrong type of greed that you don't want. And I guess that's pretty much all I can take away from this book. Now, there is a lot to it. It is a long read, but I really recommend you read it, and I really recommend you really think about it and soak it up. Maybe watch this video, and if you come up with a new concept, or think of something that maybe I didn't cover, or even have something to argue against me, just put it in the comment section. And if you have some idea, clarify it, put it in the comment section, make sure other people can understand it. But I believe this will give you a starting point to kind of think about the book if you haven't thought about it, or it'll give you some points to agree or disagree on if you've already read it. But again, highly recommend reading it. It's a good book. It's very interesting, very entertaining, because it is a fiction book. It does follow, like, you have characters and you have a storyline. It's really long, so it'll probably take you a while to read it, but it's well worth the read. And again, don't get the misconception wrong that it's not about being a greedy capitalist who's basically out to fuck everybody else in the world and just do what's good for them. It's more about try to do what's best for you in the way that others will benefit as well. Thanks for watching the video, guys.